away. To our destination, no license, no insurance, not even registration. Tagged on the plate, say December 8th.
Hey, good morning and welcome to this week's edition of the Ride Along Radio Show. Today is actually our episode number 9 or segment.
Wow.
Number 9, I know, right? It went by fast, man, so far. Almost in double digits here.
Yeah, it goes quick.
Yeah, we're getting there. Okay, so if this is the first time tuning into the show, the Ride Along Radio Show is a show that we put together to present our perspective as law enforcement officers to issues that affect the community and are of importance to both the police and the community, actually. And, of course, all law enforcement officers are also members of some community. People forget that we were civilians before we became cops, right?
Or that we still have families and
that
kids
we
in
still have
school.
family. And then when we're off duty,
Right.
we're out and about in society like everybody else. There's not like a ranch where they raise police officers just to do that. And then when they're off duty, they go back to that ranch. I mean, we're out in society like everybody else. So we try to give you our perspective on different topics, you know. And as retired police officers, we can tell you our perspective without worried about what we're going to hear on Monday when we get back to work. As I always say, being passed over promotion or not getting that transfer that you want or any other punk retribution that goes on in law enforcement agencies, okay? We don't have to worry about that, so we can just shoot you straight. And, also, sometimes we'll touch on things that may have a political bend to them, and you'll get our perspective on that, too. And again, we have a wide variety of political opinions on pretty much every topic.
Yeah, we sure do.
So today it's just myself, George Holt,
And Gil Contreras.
and Kent Lee is out today. He's attending to some last minute personal business. So it's just going to be the two of us. We always start off with our news of the day segment. And for anybody who's been following the news, you know that we had a mass casualty incident, a mass shooting incident yesterday here in San Bernardino, California. The show's based in Los Angeles, and San Bernardino is about 70 miles to the east of us, in what we call the Inland Empire. So those of you who aren't familiar with Southern California, it's actually closer to Palm Springs than it is to Los Angeles. But it's all still here in Southern California, and it just hit very, very close to home for those of us who are Southern California residents. You know, it started off with people not knowing what was going on. All we knew was that there was a mass shooting in San Bernardino. And for those of you who are familiar with San Bernardino's got a crime rate that's ridiculous. So initially I'm thinking, was it a gang thing? And then it turns out that it was something else going on there. And I really don't know. I don't know at what point we realized it was something that was a orchestrated attack, that it was something that was a higher level than what we have seen before.
Yeah, as I watched it unfold like everybody else on TV yesterday, when I heard how it all occurred, what happened, how they were dressed, I said, okay, there's only one or two possibilities. Terrorists,
right,
or radical Islamic terrorists, or this is a drug cartel hit. They're the only people who operate like that, operate in teams, use rifles, long guns with a handgun backup, wear chest rigs with additional. That's military-style assault. So
that was my initial thought.
That wasn't your classic, classic active shooter or some guy workplace violence. He got angry at work and went home to get his gun. They had too much stuff, including IEDs.
Well, and before I even knew about the IEDs, I was actually on the phone with my business partner, our mutual friend Mike Duffy, when all this went down, and we said this is clearly terrorism. Then later on in the day, I was talking to some law enforcement officers who work that area, and they were getting information that this possibly was not terrorism. And so I started saying, well, let me back up and just kind of take an impartial view, because initially we're going to think that's exactly what it is. Then when you find out that the shooter has a for lack of a better term, a Muslim or Arabic name,
correct.
Then you automatically go to that, but that doesn't mean that has to be what it is. But when you start adding in these other components, the IEDs, a more than one shooter, they didn't have he had rented a vehicle, apparently, and I don't know if it was rented specifically for this purpose, but it probably was.
Right.
It just didn't fit the classic mold of either terrorism or workplace violence. And actually, they're starting to say that it's a hybrid type of situation, because he did work there, but it may have actually been motivated by terrorism. And obviously, it's very easy to lean that way, and that's our most likely scenario.
Well, here's the thing, and this is the beauty of ride along radio is we don't have to sugarcoat stuff.
Right.
So when you hear the police yesterday and the FBI saying, well, we think it might be, it could lean that way, that means it is. If it was not terrorism, they would come straight out and say, oh, yeah, this is not terrorism. Terrorism is not involved at all. But because there was so much compounding evidence, they just couldn't come out and say that. They know that it is. The president knows that it is. And if he truly doesn't, he just said a few minutes ago, because I just got off the radio a few minutes ago doing an interview with David Cruz. If the president doesn't know that it was terrorism, he should call in to Ride Along Radio so we can give him an update.
That's 323-293-3375.
Just ridiculous
for anybody who wants to call in, including the president. Again, we don't want to jump to conclusions, especially based on preliminary things. But as it starts adding up, then sure, you got to call it. You got to call it what it clearly appears to be. I just as an investigator, man, you don't want to start out with a set of preconceived notions, because then you fall into that trap of confirmation bias where you start building a case to build what you already suspect. So you're supposed to have a completely clean slate and be objective.
Right. So if you think it's workplace violence, you're going to try to find as much, you'll leave out the terrorism stuff and then try to make it be a workplace.
But now they're admitting that it's because
they haven't said it yet. The FBI hasn't.
I heard the president say that it appears this is a hybrid event, is what he said on the way in.
Okay.
Because
the guy worked for the county, it's like calling Major Nadal Hassan a workplace violence. That was a terrorist attack.
Okay,
he even yelled Allahu Akbar when he opened up on those soldiers.
But that still gives you that component of workplace violence because the person did work there. So that's not to say that it is not anything else but that. But there's a component there too.
If a guy happens to work somewhere, but he holds these radical Islamic beliefs, and he acts based on his belief system, where he works is irrelevant to me.
Well, no, and we'll get into the definition of terrorism. That's going to be our legal term of the day, because we've been throwing around terrorist around this country like it's a household word without really getting into what makes an act terrorism and what doesn't. Like you have people calling the Planned Parenthood shooting an act of terrorism. And people were saying, well, how come they don't call it an act of terrorism? If the guy was Islamic, they would say that it was an act of terrorism. But because he wasn't, now we're reluctant to call it terrorism.
If his motivation were his radical Islamic beliefs, then it would be terrorism.
Well, but all terrorists don't hold radical Islamic beliefs. Some of them hold radical Christian beliefs, right? We've seen that.
So now you're talking about domestic terrorism.
Still terrorism, though, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
terrorism's terrorism.
Yeah. Well, there's two definitions, and one's international, and one's domestic. But that's the only difference is where it takes place. Well, essentially,
where it takes place, and then the motivation.
And keep in mind that the shooter yesterday is a U.S. citizen.
Right.
So and again, we'll get into that later on in the day. But one of the things and today's topic is actually reducing gun violence, which we had set up. This topic was set up prior to yesterday happening. So we've just kind of, I don't want to use the word lucked into this, but I mean, the timing was.
It's timely.
Yeah. I mean, and right now, unfortunately, there hasn't really been a week or certainly not a month that's gone by since we've been doing the show that there hasn't been a gun incident, a mass shooting incident. But when we talk about reducing gun violence, keep in mind that although this attacks like the one we saw yesterday where 14 people were killed in a matter of minutes, that is, and not to minimize what happened yesterday, but in terms of total body count, that is a drop in the bucket compared to what goes on in the rest of the country at large in terms of people dying due to gun violence or just acts of gun violence. We see these things like the Dylan Roof shooting. We see in South Carolina, the Planned Parenthood attack the other day. Those make a big splash in the news because it's a big concentration of people being killed at once. But in cities like Chicago, right. That's a death toll for any given week. It's just not all compressed into one sitting or one shooting.
One of the numbers I saw about Chicago, with the uprising over there, over the shooting of Laquan McDonald, over 2,700 shootings in 2015, and the year's not even over yet.
Right.
Over 400 deaths as a result of, and this is mostly criminal on criminal, black on black, brown on brown crime, and this gets absolutely no coverage. But when you get an active shooter or you get a mass casualty incident like the one we saw yesterday or in Paris, France, that takes up 24-hour news cycle. But fewer people die from that than will die.
Then the other thing. Yeah, but you know what? And, like you say in the news, if it bleeds, it leads, right? So something like that, as opposed to them.
Well, if it bleeds, it leads if it fits the narrative.
Well, but let's talk about that. And this is where I was going with that. So as opposed to them reporting on every single shooting that happens in Chicago or DC or LA or wherever, right? People have become desensitized to that, but not just that. People do not feel less safe because if you don't live in Chicago, say I live in Beverly Hills. So if I live in Beverly Hills, the crime problem in Chicago doesn't really impact me. I don't think that can happen to me or any of my loved ones. But when you have a situation like somebody goes into a mall or somebody shows up in a major city and there's widespread terrorism or widespread shootings all at once, people think, I could fall victim to that.
Right.
And so there's that fear factor, and then people are going to tune into that, and they're more interested. I mean, that's my wife and I were coming in today, and that's all we did was listen on the radio, listen to all the coverage on the different stations about this, and since yesterday and everything else. I mean, it's just really
But when you have if you have a shooting,
incredible.
We have the unrest in Chicago over Laquan McDonald, who was shot by a white cop. White cop, black victim. Just 3 weeks prior, there was a 9-year-old boy who was lured into an alley by gang members, and they were rival gang members to the kid's father. And they lured that kid into the alley and then shot him to death.
Right.
Where was the outrage? Where was the 24-hour coverage?
And here's what I say about that.
Where was the media?
Where
was Black Lives Matter?
That was heinous. But everybody expects criminals to do criminal shit like that. It was shocking that they killed a kid in retribution for what his father had done. But it wasn't the first time. That doesn't shock the senses. It doesn't rock people's sense of security because they expect
assassinating a 9-year-old boy doesn't shock the senses?
It's not the first time it's happened, unfortunately. In this country, man, we've become desensitized. And so they weren't people. I think people saw that and they go, well, damn, those gangbangers are really treacherous. But that's to be expected of treacherous people. When you see a police officer gun somebody down like that, and I think we've all seen that video, that's shocking to people, especially people who don't realize that this kind of thing could ever happen. So that's why, because people hold the police, thank God, in this country, we still hold the police to a higher standard than we do the gangbangers. So when the police do something that's even remotely close to that, yeah, you're going to get outrage. Yeah, you're going to get people marching. Because there's something to march against, by the way. There's a police chief that can be fired. There's an officer that can be held accountable. What if you march against
There's a mayor who should be recalled for hiding it for over a year.
Exactly. So there's something that can be done about that.
Chicago Police Department that has allowed these people to kill each other and hasn't done anything about it.
Well, so there's something that can be done about that because that's an actual power structure that you can point to and you can go say, hey, recall the mayor, fire the police chief, put that cop in jail. But when the gangster disciples or vice lords or whatever they got in Chicago, somebody's going to go march against them and do what?
But they should take to the streets and demand that the police department get their gang unit, their special weapons teams, their narcotics detectives, their canines, and their probation officers, parole officers, and start hitting those areas and take the bad people off the street. The career criminals who will not stop victimizing people need to go to jail, and that's what they should be doing.
Now you remember,
and the people of Chicago should be demanding they do that.
Now you remember when we were working the streets of L.A. back during the height of the Crip and Blood wars.
It was the Wild Wild West.
Right. And we'd have gang sweeps, right?
Right.
And Crash was out there working, and Metro was out there working, and our crime impact team, OSS, everybody was out there, Operation Safe Streets. And so, and for those of you who don't know, Crash is it was the LAPD unit, was a community resources against street hoodlums. If you saw the movie Colors, the characters depicted by Robert Duvall and Sean Penn were Crash officers. So you had anti-gang units out there. We were an anti-gang unit together in East LA. Right. And we were out there doing our thing, and we were being very proactive in doing crime suppression. The problem was people started complaining that there were people getting caught up in gang sweeps who were totally innocent.
Right.
All right. And that's collateral damage, and that's going to happen. And that may be why you see people hesitant. And then let's be honest, Black Lives Matter can't have this narrative of, hey, the police are killing us in scores, and it's unjustified, and it's got to stop, and then say, but we want to call the police in to go after these same people. Because either you believe one or you believe the other. It's kind of a trade-off. And unfortunately, it started off as an anti-police thing when I think Black Lives Matter should have started off as Black Lives Matter no matter who's pulling the trigger.
Correct.
And dealt with the problem from there. And then you'd have a little more ground to stand on in terms of
you'd at least
calling
have
in
some
somebody.
empathy from guys like me. Right now, they just have no credibility to me.
And that's unfortunate because I think that the aim is noble. It's just maybe a lack of direction, lack of organization, lack of a clear message. And we've been trying to get people in here, somebody from Black Lives Matter, to come in. And so far, no luck with that. But we'll keep trying. So if anybody out there knows somebody from Black Lives Matter who feels like they want to come in and have a conversation with us about it. And we don't beat people up. We don't come in there. We don't brutalize people on the show.
I do want to ask questions, though.
Certainly. I want to ask questions, too. And I have some questions that I think they deserve to have a chance to answer those questions.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So I'd invite anybody from Black Lives Matter, anybody who's an authorized representative who can come and speak and really present a viewpoint.
I don't know how you find
Black Lives
Who's
Matter.
An authorized?
Well, we had somebody.
Card,
we had somebody, and I'm not going to call her out on this show.
Like a badge?
She declined to come on the show. Well, right. But, this is somebody who's got some academic credentials, somebody with some standing who could present their case, and I'm still going to try to get her on the show. So, again, we're not going to brutalize you or whatever. We just want to have a conversation.
Right,
to answer questions that we have personally.
But we're not going to be playing softball. I'll tell you that.
No, because that's not what it's about. That's not right. The name of the game here. It's not softball at all. So listen, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to get back on the topic of reducing gun violence. And we're going to actually have our guest via Skype join us. So feel free to give us a call, 323-293-3375, and we will see you after the break. TV. Okay, I'm going to say that right now. All right, so we're back, and we just got a tweet from Ishmael at IFAHMI31. Tell your partner the editor and TV owners determine what's important on TV, right? The editor and TV owners. And yeah, we understand that, but that's based on ratings typically because it all comes back to money.
Well, yeah,
want to see.
Because, we no longer have journalism in America. We have infotainment. So if I can, this is why what you said earlier is absolutely correct. And, when I did journalism classes, because I'm actually an award-winning journalist as well, when I did classes at UCLA's extension program, they said the only thing that matters is ratings. So if it bleeds and we get you to tune, that's why police pursuits. If there's a police pursuit in your city, everybody carries it because for that amount of time, you won't turn the TV off. And all you see is the police car going like this across your screen.
Right, but people are still watching. But
they won't tune out.
Because they're waiting for a crash or a shooting or a beatdown or something.
And for that hour, you have the numbers. Therefore, you can say, hey, we have this kind of ratings during this time period. We can charge this for a commercial spot.
And being in broadcasting myself now, I totally get that. So I understand the importance of ratings. But, hey, thanks for your question, man. I appreciate that. And if you want to send us a tweet, you can tweet us at Ride Along Radio.
But I think he was trying to get at something else. It's like, it's the white corporate media that decides what we see. And I don't know. I don't know about that. I do know some reporters, and I've been interviewed for the series on KPCC, and I just got off the radio with David Cruz. There are journalists out there who are working and trying to get, the right information out there on the airwaves, to tell the real story.
Well, you know what? Absolutely. And I still tell people, though, you need to get your news from more than one source. You need to, and I don't just mean two different TV stations. I mean, there's print, there's electronic media, there's picking up a book and reading some background on some of these topics that interest you, instead of being spoon-fed. I had a teacher at high school, Mr. Platt, who used to always talk about being spoon-fed information. That's why he wouldn't let us, this is before Wikipedia, kids. He wouldn't let us use encyclopedias for any of our papers because it was being spoon-fed information as opposed to you going out, doing your own homework, and then coming up with your own opinion, an informed opinion on it. So, yeah, I agree that there's a certain amount of media, of control in the media. Maybe we disagree on what it's motivated by. Again, if it bleeds, it leads, and you follow the money. Okay, so, again, our topic today is reducing gun violence. And I don't think anyone, no matter what side of the political spectrum you sit on, would disagree that we have a gun violence problem in this country and that we need to do something about it. I think what we disagree is, where we disagree as a country is what to do about that. Okay?
Well, no.
No, some people say no guns. Some people say more guns.
I disagree with what you just said. I don't think we have a gun violence problem. We have a criminal problem.
Okay.
We have a mental health problem.
Well, hold on. But if criminals were just stealing cars, you wouldn't have the worry. When criminals commit gun violence and people who were not criminals before commit gun violence. You look at these mass shooters; they didn't have records.
They had mental health history.
They had some of them had mental health histories, whether they're diagnosed or not. True.
And they
obviously they did. You got to have a mental health problem to do that, right?
And they all have psychotropic meds in their background.
Okay, so now, but those people were not criminals per se prior to committing these acts, which they're known for, Jared Loughner and what's the guy from Colorado, James Holmes,
Right.
and Dylan Roof, and the guy yesterday, and the Planned Parenthood shooter. These are people who did not have a criminal record. These are people who were not prevented in any way from legally owning firearms, just like you or I could.
Right, but so you just cited the three, though. That's the threat. It's people with mental history who have access to guns. It's violent criminals who use guns in the commission of their crimes, and it's terrorists. That's the threat.
Okay,
the
but
threat
gun violence. Gun violence.
The threat isn't the gun.
Oh, I didn't say, hold on now. I didn't say reducing the amount of guns. Reducing gun violence. I don't think anybody would have, even if we got Wayne LaPierre, the bought and paid for director of the NRA, because the NRA represents the gun industry as far as I'm concerned,
Bought
not
and
the
paid
shooter.
for? What does that mean?
Not the shooter like they're supposed to.
What does bought and paid for mean? I'm an NRA member. I'm
And
an
you know what?
NRA
I used
instructor.
to be. I'm an NRA instructor. I used to be, all that. My belief now is that the NRA represents the gun industry and not the shooter. Imagine if the automobile club represented the automobile industry and not us as members and drivers. The kind of thing you would see happen is what we're seeing happen with the NRA. So
I don't understand the bought and paid.
Let's get back on topic here with reducing
All right,
gun
but
violence.
I'm just going to write that down.
Yeah, write it down
Bought
for future.
and paid for.
Bought and paid for
Wayne
sure.
LaPierre, NRA.
NRA, National Rifle Association.
Got it.
If nobody else wants to say it publicly, I just said it. So, all right. So I'm not running for office. Remember, that's the whole thing here. We're going to shoot it straight.
That's right.
What? Anyway, so reducing
I got to
gun
go
violence.
get my vest. I need to go.
Yeah, maybe, right? Reducing gun violence is a topic that, again, I think everybody can agree we need to reduce the incidence of violent acts committed with guns. And now sometimes those violent acts are not illegal. Sometimes those violent acts need to happen. But the vast majority, the ones that we're worried about, are the violent acts that are committed by people like we've been seeing in the news, the violent acts that need to stop. In Chicago, all the violent acts that happened over this past weekend, that's the gun violence. And our guest today is John Risenhoover. And John actually spent 25 years in the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. He was a senior special agent, and he was a national coordinator for the NIBIN program, which is the National Ballistics Information Network. And he developed, while he was the coordinator for that program, he developed the ATF's national strategy on crime gun intelligence. And that focuses not on the gun, but on the actual shooter. So, John, are you with us?
Yeah, I sure am.
All right, man. So if you can kind of expound on that a little bit in terms of what we mean by focusing on the gun and not the actual shooter.
Well, one of the biggest things we try to avoid is an argument like we just had. So what we came up with was a strategy that both sides could agree on, that the focus should be solely on the criminal shooter who's actually out on the streets today discharging a firearm illegally. And by focusing on that individual with our limited resources, we actually could provide the maximum return on investment for the taxpayers and for public safety.
I agree with that 100%.
Okay, and so that's why when Gil was talking about, and this is what I said, it's something that we can all agree on, because no matter if you are someone who feels that there should not be any restrictions on who can own firearms or how many you can own or what kind you can own, or if you think that there should not be any firearms in this country at all, I don't think there's any country in the world that doesn't have any firearms, but if you somehow are shooting for that utopian goal, then I still think this approach that John is talking about is something that everybody can get behind because, again, what it does is we don't have to fight the gun industry on this one because nobody's talking about taking away anybody's legally owned guns. We're talking about curbing behavior, right, and dealing with maybe even a mindset shift, John?
Yes, I mean, it really is, because I think most of the American public has no idea how gun violence is actually investigated. There's an assumption from what you see on TV, and anybody involved in law enforcement will clearly tell you what you see on TV is so inaccurate, it's just comical for us just to watch it, and we get a good chuckle out of it.
Definitely.
So what most people don't understand is law enforcement has extremely limited resources. I always start with my presentations just like this to let people know law enforcement's not being lazy. The town of Pueblo, just south of me in Colorado Springs, got in a lot of trouble recently for 4 hours on service calls, just to get out on service calls. So they got a lot of complaints. Their response was, we're the same size we were in 1970, but our calls for service have increased by 300%. So what did you expect to happen?
Right. Exactly. And you know what though, John, and we were talking about this earlier. I wanted to bring that up. You know, part of that is that everybody in these leadership positions, everybody that's angling for these leadership positions, they want to talk about doing more with less. They want to show that they can cut costs and that they're the person for the job because they'll be a great steward of the public's money. And they never want to bring up the fact that this stuff costs money and that the priority needs to be to spend money on that. And so this is why I think you would end up with a police department that is not the size that it needs to be, because somebody didn't want to talk about the rising crime rate, or somebody didn't want to push the issue, maybe somebody in a position of responsibility.
Exactly.
Because how else could a department have that kind of a call load that's tripled, but the police department's the same size it was 30 years ago?
Right. We've seen cities ignore gang problems and other issues. And to me, the reason I came up with this strategy is I'm from Texas. I'm a big gun owner. I have a lot of guns. And what I wanted to do was actually protect gun rights. And by reducing gun violence, I actually make the anti-gun people happy, and I reduce the call for gun control, which makes the pro-gun people happy.
Exactly.
So the whole strategy was to finally find some common ground so we could all come at this. So if you take the approach that law enforcement has limited resources and everything they do has to be smart, now you look at like a burger franchise and how they put those things together. Everything they do is for a reason. It's to provide a product. It's to make a return on investment. It's to make money for the stockholders and to provide a good product to the consumer. And we went with that whole approach when we started this whole thing for the sole purpose of identifying the problem in the market. The problem isn't people dealing drugs, even though that is a problem. But if I asked you today to prioritize what's more important for you, what should law enforcement be addressing in your community? Stolen cars, burglaries, drug dealing, somebody selling guns without proper paperwork, or people who are shooting at people and committing attempted murders. What's your priority?
Oh, definitely the gun violence part. I mean, the part where there is violence involved.
Correct.
And I can tell you right now, that's the lowest one on the entire list for most police departments.
Well, you know what? Because I think that people look at it and they say, well, these are things that are ancillary to the drug dealing. They're ancillary to the organized criminal activity, and the shootings come out of that. So if we fix this problem, if we get rid of the drug dealing, then the need for the shootings will go down, because they think that the shootings are behind drug territory, or they're over turf disputes or financial disputes or whatever. So I mean that's where our thinking is in law enforcement. I think is we try to go after not just I think they look at the gun violence as a symptom of the disease of gang activity, and so they decided to treat the disease.
And gang activity now tied directly to narcotics activity, tied directly to Mexican cartels who operate daily in Southern California, moving dope, money, and guns.
Let me tell you, I know a guy I went to high school with, and he's a big-time drug dealer, and he owns a corporation now. And I can guarantee you, anybody who's involved in the business of making money, the last thing they actually want to do is draw attention to yourself. And the best way to look at that is look at El Paso, and it's one of the safest cities in the United States. Lowest gun violence, no shootings, no nothing. You cross the border into Mexico, we're in that same, right across the border, across that bridge.
Yeah, right across the river. Been there a couple of times. Yeah,
one of the most
right there.
violent cities in the U.S. Why? Because the drug cartel does their business in El Paso. The vast majority of gun violence that's committed in this country, and I know it's contrary to what everybody believes, is committed by young men who are immature, who are doing shootings over women, respect, and old feuds. You go into New Orleans. It's one of the most violent cities in the U.S. There is no cartel presence there. There is no blood or Crip presence there. No gang goes into New Orleans because everybody in New Orleans the gangs are crazy. But they're all based on neighborhoods, they're based on territory, and they're not about drugs, they're about stupid stuff. Now, I know that's hard to believe, but the federal government has been pushing this for years because it gives funding to federal agencies, it gets jurisdiction, but it gets us off focus. The focus has to be on the criminal shooter. And when we actually started doing this, what we found is when we look at criminal shooters, only 4% of them have any kind of conviction or arrest for narcotics. 4%.
Now, let me ask you this, though. Is that because within an organization like that, like any of the gangs in New Orleans or even out here, you have the soldiers and you have your other people who have these jobs, the mules and so is it possible that if I'm a shooter, then it's not my job to move the weight? I go and do what the general tells me to do, so to speak.
Right, but what we find is this huge cartel-driven, gang-driven organization doesn't really exist. Even the gangs are stupid. Yes, you have the gangster disciples. You have MS-13. You have some very violent gangs where everybody in the gang is violent. But even then, what do I need to focus on? Do I need to go on with the presumption that everybody in the gang is a violent felon and he's shooting people? Or do I actually take my limited resources and target shootings? And when I talk about this, this is what most people get confused about, is if you live in a bad part of town and tomorrow somebody does a drive-by shooting of a house, no detective is ever going to be assigned to that case. The police will take an initial report. It will be brief, just maybe a page long, and they'll move on.
Right, because they're down that many calls. Like Pueblo, Colorado, their call loads up 300%, and they have to move on to the next deal. Sure.
What was that call actually for? It was an attempted murder.
Essentially, sure. And if someone had been hit, they exactly would have said that, no doubt.
And if somebody does get hit, when I was working in Phoenix setting up their program, what we found is the ag assault detectives in Phoenix were getting anywhere between 3 and 4 cases a day. Now they still have to manage their cases, prosecute their cases. They can.
Now,
they have
let me break that down for people who are not in law enforcement. Ag assault is cop slang for aggravated assault, which out here we call maybe assault with a deadly weapon in California. Typically, it's a gun-related crime. You point a gun, shoot a gun, but you don't hit the person. Then we would fall under the category of aggravated or ag assault. I'm sorry, go ahead. I just have to kind of make sure people can follow us.
If you want a detective to get assigned to your case, you need to bleed at the scene. Because if no one bleeds at the scene, patrol will just take a report and move on to the next call for service because they're so backlogged. So now we've determined that no one's working shots fired, which are actually attempted murders, because we just don't have the manpower for it. Now we've realized that when somebody does get hit, if you don't know who shot you and you can't tell the ag assault detective, he's having to triage his cases.
Or you won't tell
which is even worse. And that's what we found in New Orleans. That's when we started threatening the guy who got shot in New Orleans, saying, "Okay, now you're my target because I know what you're going to do."
Right, exactly.
These guys never hit each other. So what we're trying to identify is the fact that we don't pay attention to gun violence until somebody dies. But the harshest reality on when we talk about how murders are down in the U.S. right now, do any study, go to any hospital, and they'll laugh at you because when I came on 25 years ago, we wouldn't put a tourniquet on an arm or a leg if somebody was leaving the scene. Exactly. We'd wait for the ambulance.
Yeah.
Today, if one of my guys gets shot, I'm putting a tourniquet on him and I'm throwing it in the back of my car and I'm driving like hell. That same lesson every gang member in the U.S. knows now. They know to get you on steel, get you to an operating room, and you'll save a life. If they get you into an operating room, if you're alive, they can usually save you today from a gunshot wound.
Yeah, because the treatment. So it's not for lack of trying. It's just that medical technology and medical training is more available, and so it's so much better.
It's almost like we've been at war for 20 years. Oh, yeah, that's
yeah, we have. You know, it's funny you would say that. When Gil and I worked Watts together, there a hospital there. The big hospital was Martin Luther King. Actually, I think it's reopened now, right? But we called it Killer King, and the reason was that people would turn up there, and if they didn't die from the gunshot wound, sometimes they die from the infection because they were just issues. It can actually, we lost a deputy sheriff that way. But you know, Martin Luther King had so many gunshot wounds that they treat on a daily basis that it became the training ground for the U.S. Army's Medical Corps. So doctors who would normally be at Walter Reed in Maryland would be sent out to Martin Luther King Hospital in South Central LA, specifically in Watts, because they could get training during peacetime on gunshot wounds at that hospital. So I certainly understand what you mean in terms of us being at war. But before we were at war, there were urban hospitals that were used as training grounds for our military doctors because that's where you saw your gunshot wounds.
Right. So we've really evolved on how we treat gunshot victims. We can really save a lot more. But the problem I really see is for every 100 shootings, someone will finally get hit. Now keep that in mind. For every 100 shootings, somebody finally bleeds, so we assign a detective finally.
Now you say 100 shootings, you mean shooting incidents or 100 rounds fired?
100 rounds fired.
Okay.
For every 1,000 rounds fired, we finally see somebody die. We ignore all these crimes until they escalate. So I've seen, well, we saw this several years ago here in Denver. We saw one gun, I think used in a total of 15 shootings, finally started killing people. We could see the escalation of violence, just like anybody else. If you don't correct Billy's behavior on the playground, he's only going to progressively get worse. So you identify this bad behavior, these shootings, by collecting evidence at crime scenes, with the ballistic evidence. We compare it into a system. We match it that the same gun's being used repeatedly. Then we go out there the next day, knock on a door, because you've been on the street. When a shot's fired, when you show up, how many people are standing around waiting to give you a statement? Yeah, there's the laugh.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the excuse why we don't take a good report, because everybody's gone. But if I go back the next day or the day after, we called it porch time, go up on people's porches, talk to them like a human being, be decent to them, because most of the people who live in this community, in the inner city communities, they want the gun violence to stop. That's
Certainly.
one thing.
That's real. It's real to them. It's not something they just see on
real.
TV.
They don't want us jacking every kid who's wearing a hoodie. What they want us to do is identify Billy the Kid specifically and go get Billy the Kid off the streets. And we can do this very quickly. Within a couple of days, we can identify Billy the Kid in numerous shootings. What we did here in Denver is then we put an officer safety bulletin out informing officers on patrol that there's a guy, we can't arrest or detain him yet, but you need to be aware of him because we know he's carrying a gun and he's done numerous shootings, and we're trying to work a case on him. Now, as you know, there's the cops who will say, thanks for letting me know. I'll keep my eyes open. And then there's the other half of the cops who go, game on.
Right, because now we know he's carrying a gun.
We had one guy we caught. He had 7 shootings, 2 attempted murders, and no one would identify him. In fact, when we showed a photo lineup to one girl, she started crying when we showed her the photo lineup. She pointed him out, but then cried and said, I'm not going to identify him. Well, they were able to go pick him up for habitual traffic offender, lock him up for 6 months. Guess what happens when he's in jail?
Shootings go down.
And witnesses come forward.
Right.
The Police Executive Research Forum came out here to Denver and did a study on this. They said if we can target the right guy in an area, that one guy, we can reduce gun violence in that area by 70%.
Now, that requires a surgical approach, though, and that's like you said earlier. The community doesn't want to have people, they don't want a sledgehammer for something that requires a scalpel because they don't want every kid in a hoodie getting jacked up. So if you could be surgical about it, sure. But now where will we get those resources? Because, again, we have these departments that can't handle radio calls in a fast enough manner. So where would those resources come from to get people to stop and collect shell casings, et cetera, et cetera?
You got to reprioritize. This is the biggest issue we have in law enforcement. We have called everything that happens bad in our communities based on drugs. I'm anti-drug. I am totally anti-drug. I don't think they should have approved marijuana in Colorado to begin with. But I'm telling you, how many people do we assign to drug task forces? If you looked at ATF today, 70% of ATF's resources go to buying street-level drug buys. Now,
let me ask you about that, because ATF stands for alcohol, tobacco, firearms, and now explosives. And I don't see narcotics any place in there. So why would they take ATF's resources and put them toward narcotics?
The same reason FBI puts a ton of people on drug task forces. The same reason PDs put a ton of people. There's no shooting task force to work habitual serial shooters in your community, even though that's what we find really is going on. There's not every kid carrying a gun is my problem, even if he's a convicted felon. What I have to focus my limited resources on is what's going to give me the biggest bang for my buck. The biggest bang for my buck is to get the guy off the streets who's actually pulling a trigger and committing criminal shootings. Everybody agrees with this philosophy, but for some reason, we can't ever seem to get it to implement it. You know, at the end of the day, it's still fun to go back and be in Crockett and Tubbs and buying dope.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why the individual agents or officers definitely want to do the narcotics thing. But also there's funding for that. There's funding for drug task forces. And every drug task force I was ever on, be it with the DEA or whoever, there was some federal funding attached to that. Either my position was a grant position, a grant funded position, and it required that I go do that, or we got a piece of any seizure money as a result of that. The
asset forfeiture fund. So ask yourself, if you're providing public safety, what's your priority? Getting a piece of the asset forfeiture fund or reducing violence in your community? What's your priority?
It should be reducing violence in the community. Again, I think people have just come to expect that this is just the way it is. And again, I think they see that the drug cartels, or not drug cartels, but drug activity creates these other things. Like people talk about prostitution and they say, well, that's a victimless crime. However, the flip side of that is that it comes along with drug abuse. It comes along with other vice-related activities. And I think that's how we look at narcotics at the gang activity. because we say gangsters, by definition, bring guns and they're violent. And this is why we have so much gun violence. So let's fix the gang problem. But again, as you said, Billy Badass out there shooting people is the issue. Billy Badass is the one that we need to be going after and curbing his behavior and setting an example for him. Now, there are people who are going to say, well, what about the sentencing laws? This is just another play to lock up more young men from the inner city, right? The whole prison for profit thing. So what do you say to that criticism or that question?
Well, and I think not doing what we're doing today and only focusing on people when they finally commit a murder is the biggest travesty to these young men. What I would much rather do, and this is where it gets controversial, I'd rather lock up a young man who's stupid and doing stupid crimes. I'd rather lock him up for 6 months on a shots fired, which is actually an attempted murder, get him in jail for 6 months to let him know that behavior is not acceptable, then finally ignore his bad behavior until he finally kills somebody. So now I have a black hole where somebody died and his family is devastated. And now I'm going to lock up this young man who's a shooter because I've ignored his behavior for the past year, all the shootings he's been doing. And now I'm going to lock him up and throw him in prison because we know after he comes out in 30 years, he'll be a better person.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, this is how that works, right? Yeah, not.
That's how it works.
Yeah,
so
not.
What would you rather me do? Would you? And the whole thing of it's thug killing thug. Hey, that's the most racist thing I've ever heard in my life. No one dies. No one's allowed to kill somebody else. It's illegal. It's a crime. I don't care who's shooting who. We're going to stop this crap when we can, when it's criminal shootings. Because if I don't address Billy the Kid on the street today, and I leave him out on the street shooting at people, the reality is somebody's eventually going to have to pick up a gun and shoot back at him. And what we've seen time and time again is Billy the Kid spawns other Billy the Kids.
Oh, sure. And this is why he has to be made an example of. But, and thinking about just our dynamic here in Los Angeles, Billy the Kid can go stand at 103rd and Grape Street in Watts, and he can crank off a full magazine. And if he doesn't hit anybody, there'll be very minimal effort made to catch him. But he can't go to the intersection of Wilshire and Rodeo in Beverly Hills and do that exact same thing. He can get away clean, but there's going to be resources poured in to getting that person and finding out who did that. And I think it's because, obviously, one has become acceptable behavior, or it appears to be acceptable behavior in one part of town, where it's not in the other. But it shouldn't be acceptable anywhere. Like you just said, no one's allowed to kill anybody. So we need to treat all these as if they happen in Beverly Hills.
And people who live in the good part of town, a great example of that, if you've ever heard of a place called The Village in Florida, where it's a retirement community, very nice. I hope to someday retire there. I think it's a beautiful area. But what they find is people who live on the outskirts of the village are now getting home invaded. So if you think that people can't drive, the same people who are victimizing people down in Pueblo, south of Colorado Springs, are driving 45 minutes north and involved in shootings in Monument. If you can't realize that people can move, and sometimes when they're going to do a really heinous crime like a home invasion, it's even better to leave your neighborhood and go somewhere else.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, no doubt.
Identify this, I hate to say it, the same thing we're doing overseas, we can do here in our own country. We can identify the bad behavior, address it. I'd much rather address it on a minimal scale rather than, and how offensive is it that we're going to wait for the kid to commit a murder? Who's the victim?
Right. Well, and that's the thing is who's going to end up being the victim? You don't even know. If we let this go, where it'll culminate. No, I totally understand that. And I think that your approach is one that people should be able to get behind. But again, as always, like I was speaking about earlier, when we talk about media priorities, it's follow the money, right? And is there the funding needs to be there for that. And as you say, it's not necessarily an additional funding thing. It's just reprioritizing and reallocating that funding. But the institutional obstacles you're going to have are those people who built their career on narcotics.
That's what we're finding in ATF. The biggest hurdle we have right now is the undercover guys in ATF who just swear up and down everything revolves around dope. We got to do dope. And this is using technology and science and basically old street tactics of knocking on doors and talking to people like a human being. I know it sounds shocking to do that, but just interviewing people and saying, okay, who's the problem? We've linked this gun. The first one we had here in Colorado Springs, we linked 2 shootings. They went out, they interviewed the first guy. And they said it was Billy was shooting at Timmy. They go knock on at the location of the second shooting, knock on a door, and who opens the door but Timmy? And what does Timmy say? Yeah, Billy was shooting at me. He's trying to kill me, but I don't need your help. I'm going to take care of it.
Right, so we know what that means.
Right, so what are you going to do? Well, we'll just let them settle it. Hey, anybody who had figured out that these guys can never hit each other needs to wake up. Because if there is a 3-year-old girl sitting on her bed reading a book, she will catch the bullet for these knuckleheads.
Exactly right.
So
exactly right. Or the grandmother, right? The grandmother on the front porch.
It wears me out that we are still having to argue over public safety and what our priorities are. Is it more important to get part of the DEA asset forfeiture fund and get some of that money? Is it, yes, drugs are important. Auto theft's important. Everybody, when those things touch them, burglary is important. Everybody wants those crimes investigated. But the American public is under a false impression. And I tell you, I've been in police departments with police chiefs who didn't even know this was going on in their own agency, that we are not investigating shootings. We are not investigating aggravated assaults with bodily injuries for the most part. The only thing we take seriously is homicides. We recently met with a big city outside of D.C. Well, it was one of the counties. And we were talking to them about working with them to develop this strategy, and they really weren't excited about it until we finally explained to them that they were going to keep the homicides. We were just going to work the shots fired and ag assaults with bodily injury. And they said, oh,
got you.
You know what they said? Sure, knock yourself out. We don't work those.
Wow.
They didn't care.
And that's incredible, man. Okay, so listen, we're going to have to take a short break. But I want to keep you on the line because we want to jump right back into this after the break. And we're going to have like a 2-minute break. Okay, so we'll be back in 2 minutes. And if everybody wants to call in, area code 323-293-3375, or you can tweet us at Right Along Radio. I look forward to your input. We'll be right back. Right Along Radio Show. Our topic today is reducing gun violence. And our guest via Skype is John Risenhoover, who's a retired ATF agent. The ATF is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And he was responsible for a lot of their gun tracking and gun intelligence initiatives while he was on the job. John, you back with us?
Mm-hmm.
John, are you back with us? Okay, hold on. Maybe we need to get his levels up. John, you back with us? I still don't have him. Okay, I'll let you try to get him while we
He's still on the
get
break.
back on topic. Yeah. So, okay. So, basically, I don't know. You caught a lot of what he was saying in terms of.
Yeah, it reminded me of the target area strategy that we used to employ back in the 80s and 90s. It was, going into an area, a high crime area, and then specifically targeting the troublemakers. And this is exactly what I had said.
Okay, hang on.
I got you.
Getting some feedback. You're back with us?
Yep.
All right. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Gil was saying that this is targeting troublemakers and like a targeted enforcement kind of thing that we were doing.
Correct. That's what we used to do. We called it a target area strategy, where we targeted a specific, rather than come in and do Operation Hammer, where we had 1,000 cops on the street, which I got to participate in back in the day. The target area strategy was more focused, and and using that coupled with probation and parole checks on these specific individuals, we definitely had an impact on crime pretty quickly.
Well, you know what, and that's the thing is that this sounds like an even more surgical approach, because we're now talking about individuals that are responsible for the particular issue, as opposed to this area is a hotbed of narcotic activity or gang activity or whatever.
Because this kind of sounds like broken windows theory kind of thing, where you address the small things and that kind of impacts the bigger things. Is that kind of what you're talking about, John?
A little bit, but the saddest part is you're actually hitting it, because when somebody shoots at somebody, we call it either shots fired, illegal discharge, criminal mischief. But the reality is, when you look at these shootings, you actually go back and talk to people, they're all attempted murders. So it does look like we're doing broken window, but what we're finally acknowledging is what's been going on for years, and is an attempt to minimize crime, because every police chief wants crime to go down under CompStat and everything else under his jurisdiction, and every mayor wants to keep the tax base up. So the lower the crime is, the higher the tax base stays, and it makes everybody happy. But the reality is, me as a gun owner, this violence continues, and then all of a sudden it escalates, nobody's addressing it, and then I hear the president on TV saying we need gun control, as opposed to a surgical strike against the actual problem that I need addressed, which is the criminal use of firearms by criminals. I'm not talking about a citizen having a gun. I'll go as far as saying right now, I don't even care about convicted felons with guns. We don't have the resources right now, according to everything you've heard, to address people shooting at people. Tell me where that is on the priority scale.
Well, it's not. And again, like you said, unless it's a hit, then people don't look at that as an issue. And honestly, it gets swept away as kind of like a quality of life issue because it's not a reportable crime, not a reportable stat, and it's not something that anybody can be held accountable for, which is probably what the bottom line is. But now let me ask you this question: as you've gone around the country and you preached the gospel of this approach, have you gotten some support? Have you gotten more pushback? I mean, does it look like we could see a sea change with this?
It's funny. You've got to get the labs involved because most crime labs really are slow. They don't service the customer. But when you find a crime lab that's willing to work with you or a police department, you put your efforts into that. You don't go just where you want to go. You go where people are willing to work with you and the crime exists. So we've implemented that. We've started this in Memphis, and it's doing very well. We implemented it in New Haven, Connecticut. It was killing it for a while, but basically then the priority went back to buying drugs by the ATF people there, so it sort of fell back off. We're trying to implement it in PG County outside of D.C. We're trying to implement it in Chicago, but that's a really tall order.
Sure it is.
A lot of people will say we're implementing it, but that's the old federal government, fast talk of we don't like to establish goals, so that way we don't have any expectations.
Exactly.
Right. Exactly.
And if you've ever worked
Implementation.
with the federal government, you know the joke there that we don't want to establish expectations because then if we don't meet them, we fail.
Right.
So if there's no expectations, whatever you do is a success.
Or you can paint it as one at
Or
least.
you
for
can
sure.
call it one.
Yeah.
Everything's called a success, and at the end of the day, when we've gone and I presented this to Congress twice, Congress gave us funding, but at the end of it, most of the money went back to doing what ATF always likes to do. It didn't go to this program. This happens again and again. And to me, I take it really personally because this strategy is designed to save lives. That's all it's designed to do. It's not to make careers with prosecutors or
Right.
with agents or with detectives because you're going to take people off on lesser crimes. So you don't get big RICO statutes. You don't get homicide cases. Instead, we address young men who are misbehaving, and I can arrest them and put them in jail for 6 months to a year and let them know that's not acceptable behavior. Or I can ignore their behavior and watch it escalate because we've seen that with these gang members who become shooters, that it goes from a shots fired to a shots fired into a residence to a shots fired at a person to somebody being shot to somebody being killed. And it happens very quickly as they become desensitized to the violence. And this is the same rules that you would have on a playground. If you don't address Billy's bad behavior, he's going to keep escalating until you address it. So don't be surprised when Billy's been pushing somebody down the stairs for the past 2 months that he finally pushed somebody down the stairs and killed him, and then you're surprised.
Right.
But you've been
and he's been trying all this time. He just hasn't. They haven't landed wrong yet. And so
Right.
finally, when they land wrong,
Turning the gun sideways.
yeah, turn the gun sideways. Yeah. So
Okay.
you know what? And people may or may not be familiar with this, but there are certain types of crimes that certain criminals will steer away from. And so if being the shooter is the thing that's going to make it hot out there, as they say, it's going to bring the heat on you. If there's shootings over here, you will see a decline in that, even if there's hits or not. If it's known that gunplay will bring unwanted attention to your neighborhood, and not just the local police, but the feds also, a lot of the decline, and this is where we see, and I'm not saying criminals are going to stop being criminals. I'm saying they'll find other crimes. This is where we saw a lot of your sex trafficking and a lot of your pimping go up, is because people got away from dope dealing because dope dealers were getting life sentences. And they realized I can get into pimping and I can make pretty much the same money, and I never have to worry about the judge handing me an L. So criminals will move away from certain crimes if they don't feel that the risk is worth the reward. So if we make the shooter the bad guy, so to speak, the one that we start putting an emphasis on punishing the shooter much more harshly than we have been, or just paying more attention to it, I think you actually could see an incident, a reduction actually in the incidence of gun violence.
I don't know.
Right.
How do you identify who the shooters are? Because I'm thinking we're really just talking about gang members here. Gang members are drug dealers, drug movers, drug holders, drug users.
Well, there's technology for that.
They're
though.
the
There's
only
technology
guys
for that.
I know that carry guns every day, everywhere they go.
Well, now, John, earlier we were talking about IDing a particular gun, right?
Right.
So can you talk about that a little bit and talk about the how that can be used to track a particular shooter. To answer Gil's question,
we can use bullets, but we mainly use shell casings because shell casings even a car can drive over them and doesn't deform them. Bullets have a bad habit of hitting things and getting deformed. So we use shell casings, but every time a gun fires a shell, it actually leaves its own fingerprint on there, on the firing pin, the breech face, the extractor marks. They all come back and put their unique identifiers on that gun. So what we do is we compare those. We pick them up at crime scenes. If we have technology like ShotSpotter, the acoustic system,
right,
it actually increases our data collection because instead of going to a square block looking for where the shooting was, it'll get us within about 20 feet. So it's great technology to help us with that. We put the shell casings in. We quickly identify the same gun's been used in numerous shootings. Depending on where you're at, in Chicago, you might not pay attention to a gun until it has like 3 or 4 shootings on it. But then once you do that, you actually go back, you knock on doors, you start talking to people, and you get people to tell you, you know what? Most people in the community want the shooters gone. They just don't want you jacking with everybody who walks up and down the street who happens to be a young black man.
Yeah, so and they don't want to be jammed up. They don't want their nephew to be jammed up, who's just coming home from his job at Burger King or whatever. And,
right.
and you know, and then we have the chance that something could happen. But you know, so now eventually, though, we figure eventually somebody's going to get caught with that gun.
Right. Well, even then, I tell you right now, we make these cases and lock these guys up on really serious felonies and never even recover the gun. Once we identify them, they're usually involved in other criminal activity. So we're quickly able to go out and arrest them for something. And once we arrest them, we can get the other witnesses to come forward. Once they're in custody, it just changes the dynamic. But see, this is the assumption everybody had, that somebody was working these cases.
Right, and nobody has been
really. These cases for the past 20 years. Shots fired or victimless crimes. Nobody got hit, so I guess that's a victimless crime.
Until
so
it
we'll
isn't.
walk away from them.
Until it isn't, though.
With bodily injury, what are you bitching about? You lived. You need to get over it and move on. I horribly make the joke when I do presentations. If you want somebody to actually work your crime scene, you need to be good enough to die there.
Wow.
But that's the harsh reality.
And that's unfortunate, man. And you know, I think that's an issue of resources and priorities, like you've been saying. And so there needs to be a change. You know, unfortunately, there needs to be a lot of changes in many industries, but the one we're focused on here is American law enforcement. And there needs to be some changes on the way we do business. There needs to be changes on a lot of the way we do a lot of things. This is one of them, quite clearly. We're going to have to start wrapping. You have any closing questions or remarks, Gil?
You know, it seems like I understand, John, what you're saying and the points you're trying to make. I just don't think, and maybe you can speak to this as a supervisor, because I remember, you know, when I was working patrol and in crime impact, and I start working a case, building it up on a guy, you know, pretty soon I have my supervisor telling me, "Hey, man, you got to hurry up, or I got to get you to move on to something else." Right. You know, because
the caseload, sure.
Right.
There's other stuff out there, sure.
So I don't know. I mean, it seems to me like we could just go back to, you know, detectives and a couple of patrol guys getting probation and parole and doing targeted checks on parolees. These are the guys with the guns. These are the guys with the criminal history.
Well, not always, though. As he said, some of these guys don't even have any criminal history prior to, until they do. You know, so see a lot of these shooters who won't even be in the system.
Right, but I think there are fewer of them than the guys who do shooting for a living and carry guns for a living. Bad guys.
The guy you think is a shooter, that you've thought you're as a shooter your whole life, what we keep finding is the guy who's mouthy and giving you grief. It's Squiggy sitting in the back room and won't make eye contact with you, and he keeps his mouth shut and he avoids all contact with law enforcement because he's the really dangerous one.
He's the guy who's got something to hide for sure.
So we're instead of going with presumption and gut feeling, I'm going with hard science, interviewing, and a truly targeted identifying and getting the actual guy that I need to get off the streets. Because I always hear, well, they'll switch guns, they trade guns, they do this. The guns they're carrying today are not the crap guns we saw them carrying when we started 25 years ago. You know, they were carrying Ravens and Jennings back then.
Right, Lorsons and stuff, yeah.
Yeah, Glock we catch them down here with FNs. We catch them with H and Ks.
Right, and they're not swapping those out.
Glocks. And a lot of them are stolen.
Oh yeah, for sure. But once a guy gets it, that's his Glock. He's gonna hang on to that.
But you can make the case and never recover the gun, but you're actually not making guesswork of it. You're getting the actual shooter off the street, not who you think the shooter is.
Well, John, we're gonna have to have you back on, man, so we can actually get deeper into this. And we keep talking about expanding the format of the show, and this is clearly one of those times where we should expand our time frame on the show. But John, I appreciate you joining us. We appreciate the input, man, and I really want to hear more about this. I want to talk more about this in the future. So hopefully you can join us again on a future show.
10-4, brother. I'd be happy to.
All right. Thank you very much. That was John Risenhoover, who's a gun blogger and a retired ATF special agent. We're gonna wrap this edition of the Ride Along Radio Show, and again, hopefully, we've been able to shed some light on our opinions, at least, or on some strategies on reducing gun violence, and we try to get to the root of the problem and give you our input. If you have any suggestions for future topics, you can send us an email at ridealongradioshow@gmail.com. You can send us a tweet at Ride Along Radio, and like us on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram at Ride Along Radio Show, and follow us on Twitter. And we will see you guys next week, Thursday at 11 a.m. here on the Morris Media Network. Be safe.